Taking care of someone you love should never feel like a burden, but when you're the only one carrying the weight, it eventually becomes something so heavy that you start to wonder if you'll ever be free of it. 4 years I put my own life on hold, gave up opportunities, walked away from relationships, and abandoned any dream I had of building something for myself, all because I couldn't bear the thought of my mother going through her final years alone. While my brother Ryan lived his life without a single obligation, traveling, partying, and making excuses for why he couldn't be around, I was the one who was there every single day. I was the one who made sure she ate, made sure she took her medications, made sure she got to her doctor's appointments, made sure she never felt like she was a burden, even when, deep down, I knew I was breaking under the weight of it all. I never complained, never asked for anything in return, never resented her for the sacrifices I made, because I knew that time was slipping away, and I wanted her to know she wasn't alone. But what I didn't expect, what I never even considered, was that when it was all over, when I finally lost her, I would come to realize that the person she had always put first wasn't the son who had been by her side. It was the one who had barely lifted a finger. Ryan had always been the favorite, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my mother's eyes, no matter how selfish or irresponsible he was. He had always been charming, always knew how to say the right things, always managed to twist a situation to his advantage, and somehow, no matter what he did, our mother always forgave him. If he missed her birthday, he was busy with work. If he didn't call for months at a time, he was just going through a lot. If he promised to visit but cancelled at the last second, he really wanted to come but something came up. I watched it happen over and over again, watched the way she would sigh and shake her head, always giving him an excuse, always finding a way to justify his absence, always telling me that he would do better next time. But next time never came, and no matter how many times I pointed it out, no matter how many times I told her that he wasn't going to change, she always smiled at me like I just didn't understand. "He loves us, Daniel," she would say, her voice tired but patient, as if I were the one who was being unreasonable. "He's just not good at showing it." I had spent years hoping that, one day, Ryan would realize what he was missing, that he would finally understand that time wasn't something you could get back, that he would wake up and decide to be here before it was too late. But that day never came, and as my mother's health declined, as the days blurred together in a cycle of doctor's visits and late nights and endless worry, Ryan remained nothing more than a name on the occasional text message, a voice on a phone call when he found the time, a fleeting presence that never lasted long enough to make a difference. And yet, when she spoke about him, it was always with love, always with hope, always as if he were still the same boy she had raised, not the man who had abandoned her when she needed him the most. The last few months of her life were the hardest, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones and never really leaves. I watched her fade, watched her struggle to do things that had once been effortless, watched the light in her eyes grow weaker and weaker with every passing day. I did everything I could to make her comfortable, to make her laugh, to make sure that she knew she was loved, but I could feel the end coming, could feel the weight of it pressing down on both of us, could feel the way she was slowly letting go. Ryan finally showed up toward the very end, breezing in with his usual easy smile, acting like nothing had changed, acting like he hadn't missed everything. He hugged our mother, told her how much he loved her, promised that he would visit more, that he would be better, that he would make up for lost time, and she believed him. Of course she believed him. Even then, even as she lay there, too weak to sit up on her own, she still looked at him like he was everything. And I just stood there, watching, knowing that once again, he had done the bare minimum and had still managed to be the one she loved the most. When she passed, I felt a kind of grief that was impossible to put into words, a kind of emptiness that stretched on forever.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
A kind of pain that settled so deep inside me that I wasn't sure if I would ever be whole again. I had spent so many years taking care of her, had spent so much time worrying about her, had spent so much of my life making sure that she had everything she needed, that once she was gone I didn't know who I was without her. I had expected the grief, had braced myself for the loss, had tried to prepare myself for the reality of a world where she no longer existed, but what I hadn't prepared for, what I never saw coming, was what happened next. Sitting in the lawyer's office, surrounded by family members who barely looked at me, I expected to hear that my mother had left things fairly, that she had at least acknowledged the years I had given up to be there for her, that she had left me something. Not because I wanted money, not because I cared about material things, but because I wanted proof that she had seen me. Instead, I watched as the lawyer cleared his throat, shuffled some papers, and announced that everything, the house, the savings, the sentimental heirlooms, every last thing she owned, was being left to Ryan. I didn't react at first, didn't move, didn't even breathe. just sat there in stunned silence as Ryan let out a small, satisfied smile, as if this was something he had expected, as if this was something he had earned. The rest of the family barely blinked, barely seemed surprised, barely even acknowledged what had just happened, because of course Ryan was getting everything. That was how it had always been. That was how it was always going to be. I felt something in my chest tighten, something sharp and unforgiving, something that I didn't know how to name. I had given up everything for her. I had sacrificed years of my life. I had done everything right. And in the end, it still hadn't mattered. I clenched my fists under the table, pressing my nails into my palms, forcing myself to keep my face blank, forcing myself to swallow down the bitterness rising in my throat. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that expecting fairness was a fool's game. And yet, just as I was about to stand up and walk away, just as I was about to accept that once again, I had been left with nothing. The lawyer hesitated, flipping through the papers, his brow furrowing slightly as he reached the last page. "Actually," he said slowly, glancing between me and Ryan. His voice suddenly cautious, suddenly hesitant, suddenly unsure. "There's one more detail we need to go over." And just like that, everything changed. I sat there, staring at the lawyer, hearing the words but not truly understanding them, not really processing what had just been said. My mother had left everything to Ryan. The house, the savings, the valuables, the heirlooms, every single thing she had owned was now his, as if I had never even existed, as if the years I had spent taking care of her meant nothing at all. There was no mention of me, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices I had made, no final message telling me that she had at least seen me. It was like I had been erased, wiped clean from the story of her life, left with nothing but the hollow emptiness of knowing that, in the end, I had been completely forgotten. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, could feel my fingers curling into fists, could feel my breath tightening in my chest, but I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't let them see how much it hurt. Across the table, Ryan was sitting back in his chair with that same smug expression he had always worn, that same self-satisfied smirk that told me he wasn't even surprised by this, that he had always assumed this was how things would turn out, that he had never once worried about whether or not he would get everything. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't caught off guard. He had expected this outcome all along. "Well," Ryan finally said, exhaling slowly as he leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head like he had just won a game, like this was something he had earned rather than something that had been handed to him on a silver platter. "I guess Mom knew what she was doing after all." I turned my head slowly, staring at him, waiting for him to say something else, waiting for him to acknowledge that this was unfair, waiting for him to at least pretend to feel guilty. But all I saw in his face was that same entitled confidence, that same unshakable belief that he was meant to have everything, that he had always been the chosen one. There wasn't a single ounce of remorse in his voice. Not a single flicker of hesitation in his expression. He genuinely believed that this was his right. I glanced around the room, searching for some kind of reaction, some kind of recognition from the rest of the family that this was wrong, that this was cruel, that this was a betrayal of everything I had done. But instead, all I got were shrugs, a few murmurs of agreement, a quiet acceptance that this was just how things had always been. My aunt sighed and patted my hand as if I were some child who didn't understand the way the world worked. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly, her lips curving into a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know how your mother was. She always believed Ryan was the one who would carry on the family's legacy." I felt something inside me snap, something sharp and bitter and impossible to ignore. "Legacy," I repeated, my voice low, steady, dangerous. He didn't even bother to show up for her half the time. He didn't sit with her in the hospital. He didn't take care of her when she couldn't get out of bed. He didn't give up his life to make sure she wasn't alone. The room fell silent for a moment, an uncomfortable, weighted silence that should have made them feel guilty, that should have made them question themselves, that should have made them rethink the way they had always turned a blind eye to the truth. But instead, my uncle cleared his throat and gave me a half-hearted shrug, shaking his head as if I was the one who just didn't understand. "That's just the way things are, Daniel," he said simply, as if that was supposed to be an explanation, as if that was supposed to justify everything. Just the way things are. Like it was some kind of law, some kind of unspoken rule that I had no right to question. Like it had been decided from the very beginning that I would never matter. I could feel my hands shaking, could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface, could feel the weight of years of resentment pressing down on me, threatening to boil over. But instead of exploding, instead of shouting, instead of demanding to know how they could possibly believe this was fair, I did something that shocked even myself. I laughed. A quiet, bitter laugh that had no real humor in it. A laugh that made Ryan's smug expression falter just slightly. A laugh that made my aunt's sympathetic smile disappear. A laugh that made the entire room shift uncomfortably, as if they had all just realized that I wasn't going to accept this quietly. "Right," I said, shaking my head slowly, my voice dripping with something sharp, something unforgiving. "Of course. That's just the way things are. That's just the way it always was. Ryan takes and I get left with nothing. Ryan lives his life without responsibility, and I clean up the mess. Ryan gets rewarded, and I get forgotten." Ryan rolled his eyes, exhaling loudly as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Oh, come on, Daniel," he said, his voice thick with condescension, as if I were being unreasonable, as if I were making a big deal out of nothing. "You're acting like this is some huge betrayal. Mom loved you, okay? She just thought I needed it more." I felt the words like a slap to the face, felt them sink in, felt the final confirmation that no matter what I had done, no matter how much I had given, no matter how many years I had sacrificed, I had never been enough for her. And yet, just as I was about to stand up and leave, just as I was about to walk away from this entire mess, the lawyer cleared his throat and frowned slightly, flipping through the paperwork one more time. "Actually," he said, his voice suddenly hesitant, suddenly careful, suddenly different, "there's one more detail we need to discuss." Ryan scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, what now?" he muttered, already bored, already assuming that nothing could possibly ruin this for him. But the lawyer didn't answer him right away. Instead, he slowly looked up, locking eyes with me, his expression unreadable, his fingers tightening around the last page of the document as if he wasn't sure how to say it. And in that moment I felt something shift, something change, something I hadn't expected. Because the look in his eyes wasn't just businesslike detachment. It was hesitation, as if whatever was written on that page was something that Ryan, and the rest of the family, wasn't going to like. And just like that I realized something. Maybe my mother hadn't completely forgotten me after all. Ryan sat there, still smug, still arrogant, still convinced that nothing could possibly go wrong for him, while I sat frozen in place, barely breathing, barely able to process the fact that the lawyer was hesitating, his fingers gripping the last page of the document just a little too tightly. There was something about his expression that didn't match the cold, matter-of-fact tone he had used before, something careful, something hesitant, something that told me this wasn't just a formality, that whatever was on that page was something important. My heart was still pounding from the gut-wrenching betrayal I had just endured, still trying to make sense of the fact that my mother had left me nothing, still choking on the bitter taste of being completely and utterly erased from her final wishes. But now there was something else, something shifting in the air, something uncertain. Ryan let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes like he was already bored, like this was just another one of the many inconveniences he had to suffer through before he could go off and start enjoying his new fortune. "Oh, for God's sake," he muttered, drumming his fingers against the table. "What now? Can we just wrap this up already? Some of us actually have things to do." I turned my head slowly, staring at him, barely able to comprehend the sheer audacity of what he had just said, barely able to process the fact that he was sitting there acting like this was just some casual meeting, like this wasn't the moment he had just taken everything from me without a second thought. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to remember that Ryan had always been this way, had always believed that the world existed to serve him, had always assumed that he would never face real consequences. But the lawyer wasn't paying attention to him anymore. His eyes were locked onto mine, his face still unreadable, his posture stiff, his fingers tapping against the papers like he was debating whether or not to speak. "Mr. Harrison," he said finally, his voice lower now, more deliberate, more careful, "there is an additional clause in your mother's will that we haven't gone over yet." Ryan scoffed, shaking his head as if this was nothing more than pointless red tape, nothing more than some minor detail that didn't concern him, nothing more than a waste of his precious time. Yeah, whatever," he said dismissively, waving a hand. "Just tell me where to sign." The lawyer didn't move, didn't even blink. And that was the first moment, the very first moment, that I saw something shift in Ryan's face, something subtle, something just barely noticeable, but it was there. He still looked confident, still looked self-assured, still carried himself with that unbearable, entitled smugness, but there was something else now. A flicker of doubt, a tiny crack in the armor, a brief second where he must have realized that the lawyer wasn't acting like this was insignificant. And that meant something. It meant this wasn't over yet. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, pressing against the walls of the room like a storm about to break. The lawyer exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie, glancing between us both before finally clearing his throat, flipping to the last page and reading out loud. In accordance with the terms outlined in the will, he began, his voice even, controlled, carefully professional. While Ryan Harrison has been named as the primary beneficiary of all financial and material assets, there is a legal condition that must be fulfilled before full ownership can be transferred. Ryan's smirk vanished. I could actually see the moment it happened, could see the exact second that the words hit him, could see the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers twitched just slightly, the way his eyes narrowed as if he had misheard, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just been said. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, his voice sharper now, no longer amused, no longer indifferent, no longer treating this as a joke. The lawyer's eyes flicked toward me again, but just for a second. Then he turned back to Ryan, his hands clasped in front of him, his face completely unreadable. "It means that while you have been named as the beneficiary, there is a legal requirement that must be met before the assets can be legally transferred into your possession." Ryan leaned forward, his hands slamming against the table, his posture shifting from casual arrogance to something much more aggressive. "What the hell kind of requirement?" he snapped. The lawyer didn't flinch, didn't even react. He just calmly flipped to the next page. I barely breathed, barely moved, barely processed anything except the way Ryan's fingers curled into fists, the way his entire demeanor had changed, the way the energy in the room had shifted in a way that told me he was no longer in control of this situation. And then the lawyer spoke again. "Before any financial assets, property or inheritances are officially transferred to Ryan Harrison," he said, his voice steady, unwavering, matter-of-fact, "he must first fulfill the conditions outlined in Clause 17 of the document." I heard Ryan's breath hitch, felt my own heart stop for a second, 'cause I knew what that meant. And so did Ryan. There was a problem. And for the first time in his life, Ryan had no idea how to fix it. The silence in the room stretched so thick and heavy that I could feel it pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe, making it impossible to think of anything other than the way Ryan's expression had twisted from smug satisfaction to something much darker, something sharp-edged and furious, something that told me, without a single word, that he was about to lose it. He had walked into this room expecting to walk away untouchable, expecting to take everything without a second thought, expecting that my mother had given him the perfect inheritance, an easy ride into financial security, another effortless victory in a life where he had never once had to struggle. But now that illusion was cracking right in front of him, and for the first time Ryan had no idea what to do. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he leaned forward, slamming his hands down on the table, his entire body tense, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching under his skin. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, his voice sharp, demanding, full of entitlement. "What clause? What goddamn requirement? Just spit it out already." The lawyer didn't flinch, didn't even look up from the document in front of him, just calmly adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat before continuing. Clause 17 states that before any financial assets, properties or inheritances can be legally transferred to Ryan Harrison, he must first fulfill the obligations outlined by Margaret Harrison in her final wishes. Ryan's breath hitched, a short, sharp exhale, like he had just been punched in the gut. "Obligations," he repeated, his voice slightly lower now, as if he was still trying to convince himself that this wasn't serious, that this was just some minor inconvenience that he could brush aside. "What kind of obligations?" The lawyer calmly flipped to the next page, his expression unreadable, his tone completely neutral, like this was just another routine business transaction, like he hadn't just dropped a bomb that was about to completely destroy Ryan's plans. In order to inherit his full share, Ryan Harrison must assume full-time caretaking responsibilities for the Harrison estate, including all financial upkeep, property management, and outstanding medical debts accrued during his mother's final years. These responsibilities will be legally binding for a period of no less than 2 years before full ownership of the assets can be granted. I blinked, felt my stomach drop, felt my entire body go still as the words settled into the air, as the weight of what had just been said slowly began to sink in, as I finally started to understand that my mother hadn't just given Ryan everything. She had given him a job. She had given him responsibility. She had forced him to do exactly what I had done for years. And for the first time since this entire thing started, I felt something shift inside me, something cold and quiet, something that wasn't quite victory but was close enough. Because Ryan had no idea what he had just walked into. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable, pressing against the walls, making the air feel thick and suffocating. Ryan didn't say anything at first, just sat there, staring at the lawyer like he had just grown a second head, like he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard, like he was waiting for someone to tell him this was a joke. But when no one did, when the reality of it finally started to settle in, his face twisted into something ugly, something angry, something close to panic. "That's insane," he said, shaking his head quickly, his fingers curling into fists on the table. "That's completely ridiculous. You're telling me I have to spend 2 years taking care of some rundown house, paying off debts, and handling all the financial stuff just to get what's already mine?" The lawyer didn't even blink. "That is correct," he said simply, flipping through the papers like this wasn't about to ruin Ryan's life. Ryan let out a harsh, bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair, gripping it tightly as if he was trying to physically hold himself together. "No," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "No way. This has to be a mistake. There's gotta be some way around it, right?" The lawyer exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the document, his expression calm but firm. "The clause is legally binding," he explained, his voice carrying a quiet finality that told me this wasn't up for debate. "If you refuse to fulfill the terms, the entire estate, including all assets, will be transferred to the next eligible beneficiary listed in the will." Ryan stiffened. His breathing stopped. And for the first time since this conversation started, he finally looked at me. I saw the moment the realization hit him, the exact second he understood who the next eligible beneficiary was, the exact moment it dawned on him that if he refused to work for his inheritance, if he refused to take responsibility, if he refused to put in the effort, then everything, every single thing he thought he had just won would go to me. And that terrified him. I watched as his mind raced, as his fingers twitched against the table, as his eyes darted toward the lawyer, then back at me, then back at the paperwork in front of him, as if he was still trying to find a way out. He had never been forced to work for anything in his entire life, had never been given conditions, had never had to earn what was handed to him, and now he was being told that in order to get what he thought was already his, he had to spend 2 years doing exactly what I had done for free. And I didn't say a word. I just sat there watching him, letting him squirm, letting him process the fact that for the first time ever, he wasn't the one in control. He clenched his jaw so hard I thought his teeth might crack, his entire body tense, his breathing uneven, his face pale with barely concealed rage. "This is bullshit," he finally snapped, shoving himself up from his chair, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I shouldn't have to do this. It's my money. It's my inheritance. She left it to me. Why the hell would she make me jump through hoops for something she already gave me?" The lawyer shrugged, closing the folder with a quiet snap. "Perhaps she wanted you to understand the weight of responsibility," he said, his voice neutral. "Or perhaps she believed that an inheritance should be earned rather than given freely." Ryan froze. I could see it in his face, the way the words cut deeper than he wanted to admit, the way his anger flickered with something close to doubt, something close to fear, something close to realization. Because my mother hadn't just handed him everything. She had set him up to fail. And now he had a choice: work for what he wanted or walk away with nothing. And for the first time in his life, Ryan Harrison had no idea what the hell he was supposed to do. Ryan had always been the kind of person who believed the world would bend to his will, the kind of man who never faced true consequences, the kind of spoiled, entitled golden boy who thought that no matter what happened, he would always land on his feet. But now, for the first time in his life, he was falling, and no one was there to catch him. The moment the lawyer finished explaining the clause, the moment reality began sinking in, I watched as his arrogance shattered, as his overconfidence cracked, as the smug smirk he had worn earlier vanished completely. He was still trying to act like this was just a temporary setback, still clinging to the illusion that he could somehow fix this, that he could argue his way out of it, that he could force the lawyer to bend to his demands, but deep down I could already see it in his eyes. The fear was starting to set in. And honestly, I enjoyed every second of it. Ryan stormed out of the meeting that day without saying another word, his entire body stiff with rage, his hands clenched into fists, his face pale with barely contained fury. I didn't chase after him, didn't try to offer him an ounce of comfort, didn't even bother pretending I felt bad for him, because the truth was I didn't. I had spent my entire life watching him take and take and take, watching him walk away with everything while I was left cleaning up the mess. And now the roles were finally reversed, and I wasn't going to feel guilty about it. But I should have known he wouldn't go down without a fight. Ryan wasn't the type to accept reality unless it benefited him, wasn't the kind of man who handled disappointment well, wasn't the sort of person who had ever been told no before. So, of course, the first thing he did after storming out of the lawyer's office was call his own lawyer, convinced that there had to be a loophole, convinced that there had to be some way out, convinced that he could somehow overturn my mother's final wishes and get exactly what he wanted without doing a single second of work. He spent weeks trying. Weeks calling in favors, weeks throwing money at attorneys, weeks grasping at straws in his desperate attempt to make this go away. But no matter what he did, no matter who he hired, no matter how many times he tried to argue that the will was unfair, the answer was always the same. The clause was legally ironclad. The estate was untouchable. And unless he wanted to lose everything, he had one choice and one choice only. He had to work for it. Ryan fought it for as long as he could, still convinced that if he just pushed hard enough, if he just demanded loudly enough, if he just threw enough of a tantrum, someone would eventually give in. But the world didn't work like that. And now, for the first time in his entire life, Ryan was being forced to take responsibility, and he had absolutely no idea how to handle it. The debts started piling up faster than he expected, the bills from my mother's medical treatment still outstanding, the upkeep on the house more expensive than he realized, the property taxes coming in relentlessly, the utilities eating away at what little money he had left. He had assumed, in his usual arrogant way, that he could just ride this out, that he could sit on the estate until the 2 years were up without actually putting in real effort, that he could simply exist until the money was legally his. But 2 years was a long time, and money had a way of running out faster than you think, especially when you had no clue how to manage it. Ryan had always been reckless with money, had always spent more than he saved, had always lived in the moment without ever thinking about the future. And now that carelessness was coming back to haunt him, hitting him harder than he ever could have anticipated, dragging him down deeper and deeper until he had no choice but to accept the truth. He was completely and utterly screwed. And when people like Ryan start losing, when people like Ryan start falling, when people like Ryan finally hit the bottom, they don't know how to climb back up. So they look for someone to save them. And in this case, that someone was me. The first time he called, I ignored it. The second time I sent it straight to voicemail. By the third, fourth, and fifth calls, I could tell he was getting desperate. His messages getting shorter. His tone getting less angry and more frantic. His usual arrogance replaced with something closer to panic. Daniel, come on, man. We need to talk. Look, I get that you're pissed off, but you need to call me back. This is serious, okay? I don't have time for your little silent treatment bullshit. I need your help. But I didn't owe him anything. I didn't owe him my time. I didn't owe him my attention. And I certainly didn't owe him my help. So I ignored him. And when ignoring him didn't work, he showed up at my front door. Seeing Ryan standing there, looking nothing like the smug, overconfident man I had seen in that lawyer's office, looking disheveled, looking exhausted, looking like he hadn't slept in days, should have made me feel something. Maybe pity, maybe sympathy, maybe even the tiniest bit of satisfaction. But instead, I just felt done. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, forcing a weak, half-hearted smile that didn't reach his eyes. Hey, he said, shifting his weight awkwardly. Can we talk? I crossed my arms over my chest, raising an eyebrow. Talk about what? I asked, my tone even, my expression blank. Ryan exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face, muttering a curse under his breath. Come on, man, he said. His voice tight with frustration, with humiliation, with something that almost sounded like regret. You know what this is about. And I did. I knew exactly why he was here. I just wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. He sighed again, shaking his head. I need your help, he admitted, and just like that, for the first time in our entire lives, I was the one with the upper hand. Ryan stood on my doorstep, looking at me like he still couldn't quite believe that he was in this position, like he still couldn't comprehend how things had turned out this way, like he was still expecting me to be the same old Daniel, the brother who had always been there to clean up his messes, the one who had always picked up the slack, the one who had always been the responsible one. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had spent too many years sacrificing my life for other people. Had given up too much of myself trying to hold together a family that had never really held me in the same regard. Had watched Ryan take and take and take until there was nothing left for me. And now, as he stood there, practically begging for my help, I finally realized that I wasn't the loser in this situation. I was free. And he was finally learning what it felt like to be left behind. Ryan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. His frustration barely concealed. his voice tight with something that sounded a lot like desperation. "Look, I get it, okay," he muttered, shaking his head. "I know you think I don't deserve anything. I know you think I got everything handed to me, but this isn't just about me anymore. Mom left me a mess, man. There are debts I didn't even know about, bills I can't pay, legal stuff that's way over my head. I can't do this alone, Daniel." I stared at him, letting him talk, letting him squirm, letting him finally sit in the same helplessness I had felt for years, letting him experience what it was like to have no one come to the rescue. And the thing was, I knew he wasn't lying. I knew the financial situation was bad, probably worse than he was even admitting. My mother had been sick for years, and I had been the one keeping track of the medical expenses, the ones she couldn't afford, the ones that had been piling up for longer than Ryan had even been paying attention. The estate might have looked valuable from the outside, but the reality was, it was a ticking time bomb of financial ruin. And now, that burden was his to carry. I almost told him to leave. Almost slammed the door in his face. Almost let him suffer, let him struggle, let him finally face the consequences of his own entitlement. But then something changed. A few days later, while I was going through the last of my mother's things, I found a letter tucked away inside an old wooden box, one I had seen her use for years, one I had never thought much about before. My name was written on the front in her handwriting, shaky but familiar, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something break open in my chest, something I had been holding back, something raw and painful and unfinished. I hesitated before opening it, hesitated because I wasn't sure if I even wanted to read what she had to say. Hesitated because I had spent weeks hating her for what she had done, for leaving me with nothing, for choosing Ryan over me one last time. But when I finally unfolded the letter, when I finally let my eyes scan the words she had written, when I finally let myself listen, I realized that I had been wrong about everything. My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I know that you probably hate me right now. I know you think I betrayed you, that I left you with nothing after everything you've done for me, that I chose Ryan over you like I always have. And for that I am sorry. I'm so sorry, my love. But I need you to understand something. I had a plan. I knew who Ryan was. I knew who he had always been. I knew he would never change as long as the world kept rewarding him for nothing. And I knew that if I handed him everything, if I gave him the life he thought he was entitled to, he would destroy it, just like he has always destroyed everything he touches. So I left it all to him, but not without a price. I tied it to responsibility, tied it to work, tied it to something he could never buy his way out of, something that would force him to make a choice, to either finally become the man I had always hoped he would be, or to lose everything. And I left you the one thing he will never have. Freedom. You gave up so much for me, Daniel. You put your life on hold, sacrificed your own happiness, gave up your own dreams, all to take care of me. And I didn't always say it, I didn't always show it, but I saw you. I saw everything. And that's why I made sure that when this was over, you would never have to carry the weight of this family ever again. You are free, my love. Free to live your life, free to walk away, free to finally put yourself first. And if Ryan fails, if he throws it all away, then yes, the estate will pass to you. But I hope more than anything that you walk away from it all and never look back. Because you deserve so much more than a life spent fixing other people's mistakes. I love you, Daniel. And I always have. I don't know how long I sat there after finishing the letter, don't know how many times I read it, don't know how many emotions crashed over me all at once. Anger, relief, grief, love, pain, understanding. All this time I had believed that she had chosen Ryan, had believed that I was nothing more than an afterthought, had believed that I had been discarded and forgotten. But now I understood. She had seen me. She had seen everything. And this wasn't a punishment. This was justice. This was a lesson. This was her final way of making sure Ryan had to face the consequences of his life while setting me free from it forever. And now I had a decision to make. I could watch Ryan suffer, watch him lose everything, watch him crumble under the weight of responsibility the way I always knew he would. Or I could do what my mother wanted me to do. Could walk away. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure which choice was the right one. Ryan had always been the kind of man who walked through life with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences, someone who had never been told no, someone who believed that everything would always work out in his favor because it always had. But now, as I stood there watching him struggle, watching him crumble under the weight of his own arrogance, watching him fall apart in ways he never thought possible, I realized something that I had spent my entire life waiting to understand. Ryan had never been strong. He had never been capable. He had never been the man our mother had hoped he would become. He had only ever been lucky. And now, His luck had finally run out. It didn't happen all at once, didn't crash down on him in one dramatic movie-style moment, didn't come in the form of a single earth-shattering realization that made him fall to his knees in regret. No, Ryan's downfall was slow, painful, and unrelenting, the kind of failure that eats away at you little by little until there's nothing left. He spent the first few weeks after our mother's will was read trying to fight it, trying to find some loophole, trying to call in favors, trying to find some way to make the nightmare disappear. But when it became clear that no one was going to save him, that no one was going to fix this for him, that no one was going to bend the rules to make life easier, he finally started to crack. The bills kept piling up, the estate's taxes ate through his savings, the maintenance costs of the house grew bigger by the day, and the debts from my mother's medical care never stopped coming. His lawyer, the one he had hired in a last-ditch effort to overturn the will, eventually stopped returning his calls when it became clear there was no way to challenge a document that had been drawn up so perfectly airtight. The so-called friends he had once surrounded himself with, the ones who had always benefited from his success, the ones who had always enjoyed the perks of being close to Ryan Harrison, suddenly had better things to do. And just like that, Ryan had nothing. No money, no power, no control. And when a man like Ryan loses control, he has nowhere left to go. That's when the family suddenly started to change their tune. The same people who had shrugged at my pain, who had dismissed my sacrifices, who had looked the other way while I was treated as the lesser son, were suddenly looking at me differently. They weren't overt about it, weren't obvious, weren't throwing themselves at my feet in apology, but I could see it in the way they spoke to me now, in the way they suddenly valued my opinion, in the way they started to acknowledge the things I had done for my mother. It was disgusting, honestly, because it wasn't real respect. It was opportunism. They saw Ryan falling, saw me standing untouched, saw that the very thing that had made me invisible before, my responsibility, my independence, my quiet strength, was now the thing that made me the one with all the power. And they were adjusting accordingly. I let them talk, let them pretend like they had always valued me, let them rewrite history in their own minds, let them act like they had never dismissed me before. Because the truth was, I didn't need their validation anymore. Their opinions, their approval, their sudden, desperate attempts to win me over, none of it mattered to me. I saw them for what they were now, saw the way they had spent years feeding Ryan's ego, saw the way they had treated me as nothing more than a background character in my own family. And now I finally had a choice. I could do what they wanted me to do. Forgive, help Ryan, clean up his mess the way I always had, step into the role they had always expected me to play. Or I could let him fall, and walk away for good. Ryan showed up at my door one last time. His once perfect exterior now completely shattered. His usual confidence gone. His voice raw with something that almost sounded like desperation. He looked at me with eyes that were tired, with shoulders that were slumped, with a posture that screamed defeat. And for the first time in my life, he wasn't looking down on me. He was pleading with me. "You win," he said, exhaling sharply, shaking his head like he couldn't believe the words were coming out of his mouth. "Okay, you win. Can't do this." "I can't." He stopped, dragging a hand through his hair, letting out a humorless laugh, one that sounded more like a man on the edge of breaking. "I was never meant to be the one dealing with all this. I don't know how to fix it, Daniel. I don't know how to make it work. I need your help." I stared at him, feeling nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, no anger, just clarity. Because this moment, this wasn't about him learning a lesson. This wasn't about him suddenly becoming a better person. This was just Ryan being Ryan. He wasn't sorry for the years he had treated me like less. He wasn't sorry for taking everything for granted. He wasn't sorry for the way he had let me carry the burden alone. He was just sorry that now, for the first time ever, he had to carry it himself. And in that moment I finally knew my answer. I sighed, shaking my head, stepping back from the doorway, my voice calm but final. "No, Ryan," I said simply, my words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't need my help. You need to figure this out on your own." His face twisted, his hands curling into fists, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to fight, like he wanted to tell me that this was unfair, that I was being cruel. But in the end, he just stood there looking completely lost. And then, he walked away. Because Ryan had always been the kind of man who didn't know how to fight for something when it wasn't handed to him first. I watched him go, felt the weight of years of resentment finally lifting off my shoulders, felt the freedom of knowing that for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't going to let Ryan drag me down with him. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized something. This wasn't revenge. This was just justice finally catching up to him. The weight of it all didn't hit me right away. I had spent so many years carrying the burden of my mother's care, had spent so much time watching Ryan walk away from responsibility, had spent too long being the one who sacrificed while he lived without consequences, that when it was finally over, when I had finally let go, when I had finally walked away from him instead of toward him, I felt nothing but relief. I expected to feel more, victorious, satisfied, maybe even vindicated. But the truth was I just felt light, like I had finally set something heavy down after carrying it for too damn long. But the question still lingered, pressing at the edges of my mind like a dull ache I couldn't quite shake. Had I gone too far? Had I been too cold? Had I done to Ryan what he had done to me? Or was this just karma finally catching up to him? I thought about it long after I had closed the door on him, long after his footsteps had faded down the driveway, long after the realization had sunk in that, for the first time in my entire life, I was free of the obligation to clean up someone else's mess. Ryan had walked away empty-handed, had lost everything my mother had left behind, had been reduced from the golden child to a man with nothing. Not because of some cruel trick, not because I had schemed against him, not because I had taken anything away from him. Well, he had done this to himself. He had been handed everything, had been given more than most people ever get in a lifetime, and he had squandered it all because he had never learned how to work for something, because he had never learned how to value anything, because he had spent his entire life believing that he was entitled to more than he had earned. And when the moment came for him to prove he could handle even a fraction of the responsibility I had carried for years, he failed. Miserably. So why did part of me still feel like I should have helped him? I replayed our last conversation in my head, the way he had stood on my doorstep. His voice tight with something that sounded like desperation, the way his shoulders had slumped, the way he had barely looked me in the eye when he admitted he couldn't handle it alone. I had waited years for that moment, had imagined it 1,000 times, had pictured him finally realizing what I had been through, had hoped that one day he would wake up and understand. And yet, when it finally happened, I didn't feel the way I thought I would. There was no satisfaction, no moment of triumph, no sense of winning. Because the truth was, Ryan had never been my competition. He had just been a problem I was forced to live with. And now he was just a man with no way forward. I knew he wasn't doing well. I had heard from distant relatives, from old family friends, from people who still had one foot in both of our lives. They told me that Ryan had burned through the last of his savings, had moved into a cheap apartment, had started working a job that barely covered his expenses, had cut off the friends who once circled around him like vultures, had become bitter, angry, resentful of how his life had turned out. He says it isn't fair. One of my aunts had told me over the phone one afternoon, her voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. He says Mom set him up to fail. I had laughed. Actually laughed, because if that wasn't the most Ryan thing I had ever heard, I didn't know what was. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that our mother had handed him everything and asked for only 2 years of work in return. It wasn't fair that he had been given a chance to prove himself and had thrown it away because he didn't want to be inconvenienced. It wasn't fair that for the first time in his entire privileged, consequence-free life, he had been expected to take responsibility for something. Funny. Because I could have sworn it wasn't fair when I was the one staying up all night, making sure our mother took her medication. I could have sworn it wasn't fair when I had to put my career on hold while he went off and lived his life without a care in the world. I could have sworn it wasn't fair when I sat by her bedside for years, watching her grow weaker, holding her hand when she was too tired to speak, making sure she knew she wasn't alone. But back then, Ryan hadn't cared about what was fair. And now, the moment life had finally turned on him, the moment the world had stopped handing him free passes, the moment he had been forced to face the consequences of his own actions, suddenly, he wanted to talk about fairness. I wasn't buying it. And yet, the question still lingered, still hung in the back of my mind like an unfinished thought. Had I gone too far? Had I let my bitterness turn me into the very thing I had hated? Had I abandoned him when I could have helped? I didn't know. Maybe I never would. But as I stood in the home I had built for myself, in a life that was finally mine, unburdened by the weight of responsibilities that had never belonged to me in the first place, I realized that for the first time in a long time I felt free. Free of Ryan. Free of my family's expectations. Free of the need to prove myself to people who never saw my worth in the first place. And if that made me cruel, then maybe cruelty was just another word for survival. So was it justice? Or was it revenge? I wasn't sure. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was neither. Maybe karma doesn't always come the way we expect. But it always comes.